All right, welcome back. So chapter 12 marks kind of a turning point, at least a turning point compared to what we've been doing recently. So chapters 9, 10, and 11 were largely focused on nutrition. 11 was ergogenic aids, but it was a lot of it talked about nutritional supplements. So things like branched chain amino acids, creatine, etc. And so we're kind of turning the page on that, and we're moving on to 2 chapters on testing. So chapter 12 is kind of the rationale for testing, and then chapter 13 is more of a how-to. So it is a fairly long chapter, but most of it is graphics. It includes a lot of pictures and descriptions of how to do a variety of athletic tests. So things like how to administer a 300-yard shuttle test, or how to administer a 1 repetition max squat test, those kinds of things. And so again, chapter 12 is kind of the underlying rationale for that, and giving some background that really overlaps with with things you probably talked about in PE Prof 481, the major capstone class, which are things like validity and reliability in particular. So the reason that you would test is to show that your program works. That's really the overarching reason that you would test. So you want to be able to show that at the end of your off-season program that the athletes are stronger, that they're faster, they have better endurance, whatever your goals are for that program. And that matters to 2 populations, really. The first population that it matters to are to the athletes themselves, because if they can see that your program worked, that they added 15 pounds of lean mass, they lost 3% body fat, and they can jump higher, then the athletes are more likely to buy in the future. And then from a coaching standpoint, it'll also, if your program works, if you can say, look, everybody on the team, gained at least 9 pounds and they all increased their vertical jump by an average of 2 inches or something like that, then that'll help to get buy-in from the coaches as well, and also hopefully from your bosses, so that when your annual evaluation comes around, you can say, look, my program works really well, we've got fewer injuries, we've got greater performance, here are some of the measurables I can show you, those kinds of things. So it's kind of helpful, testing is helpful on all of those fronts. So reasons for testing then, the first is to assess athletic talent. And in an ideal world, you would be able to generate individualized programs. And we talked about that some in the Coaching 345 class. Obviously, that's not really how it works most of the time. Oftentimes, as a strength and conditioning coach, or even as a sport coach, you're training entire teams, or at the very least, position groups together. And so you don't necessarily have time to tailor the program, or the ability to tailor the program to individual needs. But where you can, testing can be really helpful for deciding where their performance deficits lie. So for example, maybe you've got an athlete who has a really strong 1 repetition max squat, so good force development, but a low rate of force development. So maybe they're really strong, but they're not very powerful. They have not a very good vertical jump. And so then what we would do in terms of tailoring their program is we do a lot of things where we work on rate of force development. So we would do perhaps some lightweight, very high velocity type movements, so lots of jumping, lots of plyometrics, maybe some overspeed training, those kinds of things to try to improve their rate of force development. So assessing what they're good at and what they're not good at, that's one component of testing, or one reason for testing. And again, as you can see, they're related to trying to find abilities in need of improvement. It also helps us set goals. By the end of this year, we want you to add 10 pounds to your bench press, or we want you to add 15 pounds to your power clean, that kind of thing. And so then that gives the athlete something to work toward. They're not just coming into the weight room and killing an hour 3 or 4 times a week. They're trying to accomplish whatever this goal is, and hopefully that'll provide a useful motivator for them. And then, as mentioned earlier, you want to be able to evaluate their progress. So you want to be able to show them and the coaches that your program works. Look, our athletes are getting stronger, they're getting more powerful, they're getting faster, all of those kinds of things. So in terms of terminology, so a test is a procedure for assessing ability in a particular endeavor. Nice definition there. I think we could all identify what a test was on a multiple choice quiz. A field test, though, is a little bit different in that it's conducted in the field, i.e. not the laboratory. So, for example, something like a VO2 max test, oftentimes that is performed, it's almost always performed on a treadmill. The athlete's hooked up to a mask so we can measure the volume of air breathed and the concentration of oxygen, carbon dioxide, those kinds of things, right? So a VO2 max test is a test that is almost always performed in a lab. there's a field version, or there are several field versions of those tests where we're trying to estimate what their VO2 max is. So those would be things done outside of the lab then. So that's the distinction between the two. Measurement is the process of collecting test data. So you're actually, if you measure somebody's vertical jump, you see that they are able to jump 36 inches or whatever their jump is, and so that's data, that's information that you're collecting. Evaluation is analyzing those test results for the purposes of making decisions. So we would evaluate their performance on the vertical jump and decide whether or not we needed to do more of that type of training I mentioned a second ago. So maybe we do more exercises that focus on rate of force development, or maybe they're pretty good. And so maybe we can kind of back off of that and focus on increasing body weight or something like that, some other goal. A mid-test is a test administered one or more times during the training period to assess progress and to modify the program as needed to maximize benefit. So, halfway through the off season, you're going to administer a test and see how we're progressing, see if they've added any pounds to their bench press with that example. A formative evaluation is a periodic reevaluation based on mid-tests administered during the training and usually at regular intervals. So again, based on their performance on that test, now we're going to decide if we're going to change directions, and if so, how. And then a post-test is a test done after the training. So oftentimes in research, for example, you'll see pre-test, post-test. We look at somebody's strength, we do an intervention, we have them strength train for 12 weeks, and then we look at their strength afterwards and see if it's improved. That's the pre-test, post-test model. You could throw in, if we got a 12-week program, throw in one at the 6-week mark. Now you got a mid-test. And so it's the same basic idea with evaluation, of a group of athletes during the off-season. Maybe we start the off-season program in, January after they come home or after they come back from winter break, test them again in March, test them again in May, something like that. Trying to see if there's anything else I want to talk about on this one. I don't think so. All right, so here's the stuff I mentioned you probably saw in the capstone class if you've had it. So there's two important terms here. The first is validity, and then we'll do different subsets of validity. But the thing to know about validity is it is the degree to which a test or item measures what it is supposed to measure. So if we want to measure muscular power, how quickly they develop force, is the vertical jump a good way to measure that? Yeah, absolutely. Is something like the leg press a good way to measure that? Maybe, but probably not, and it probably doesn't have a lot of generalizability to their sport performance because, leg presses are at the very least you're seated, potentially you're on your back, and so that's not a very similar movement to what we're going to see in sport, and so with that, then that may not be the best assessment for us to perform, the best test for us to perform for our athletes. So there's different kinds of validity. The first one there, as you can see, is construct validity. So construct validity has a lot of overlap with that definition that's already on the screen. So the definition of construct validity is the ability of a test to represent the underlying construct, which is the theory developed to organize and explain some aspects of existing knowledge and observations. So the idea here is that construct validity is kind of overall validity. It is, as I said, it's pretty similar to the definition of validity itself, is does the test measure what it is supposed to? And then the next one's face validity. So face validity is the appearance to the athlete and other casual observers that the test measures what it is supposed to measure. So if the athletes think that a vertical jump test is a good measure of their lower body power, then they're likely to try harder and you're likely to get better results and more consistent results. So face validity, if the test looks like it measures what it's supposed to, that might help the athletes respond more positively, might help you get more buy-in. As opposed to, and the textbook kind of mentions this, there are tests that are performed by economists, by psychologists, where they might look like they're intending to measure one thing, but they're actually trying to measure something else. And the idea is that they mask what the test is actually supposed to measure, because otherwise people might change their answers. They might tailor them to the responses that they think the researchers are looking for rather than what the actual answers are. But in sports, in general, with our testing, we're not really trying to trick anybody. So you want it to be pretty straightforward that this test looks like it measures what it's supposed to measure, whether that's upper body strength, aerobic power, whatever it is that you're going for. Content validity is the assessment by experts that the test covers all relevant subtopics or component abilities in appropriate proportions. And so the idea here with content validity is that we would look at the components of sport performance, let's say for a soccer player, for example. And so if we think about a soccer player, what abilities do they need to perform well? And does our testing battery assess all of those things? So you got to have good sprint speed. You got to have some agility, you got to have pretty good aerobic endurance, and then maybe we'll look at kicking power or kicking accuracy, those kinds of things. And so if we assess all of those things, then hopefully that's good content validity. We've assessed all of the different parameters of performance that make for a good soccer player, right? So that would be content validity as it applies to a soccer player. So again, what that is then is you're looking at the different components of the sport or of the position, breaking those down, and then assessing those different things. Criterion referenced validity is similar to the next one that you're going to see. So criterion referenced validity is the extent to which test scores are associated with some other measure of the same ability. And so, for example, if we look at, go back to the leg press and squat. So are the test scores in the squat associated with the test scores in the leg press? That would be criterion reference. So there is some, not necessarily gold standard, because that'll come up here in a second, but there's some other test that you're comparing this one to. Are they similar enough? So where this might come in is with field tests. So I mentioned VO2 max tests are typically done in the lab, but there are different ways to estimate VO2 max, whether that is like a 12-minute run, you can do it through a bench stepping test, and there are a number of other tests. The beep test or the yo-yo test, those are also other ways to estimate aerobic capacity. And so we would look at how does their performance on some of those field tests relate to their performance on an actual in-lab VO2 max test. So the in-lab VO2 max test would be the criterion. And then if we compare the performance on 12-minute run, for example, to that, how similar are those results? So do they give basically the same results is the validity there. Concurrent validity, a similar idea. So concurrent validity is the extent to which test scores are associated with those of other accepted measures of testing the same ability. So for example, different body fat measures. So if we look at something like skin fold calipers, where you actually have to pinch their skin folds, and then we compare the results on that to bioelectrical impedance, which is where you have that little handheld device, you put in all the numbers and you hold it out in front of you. Do they both give 13% body fat or pretty close to that? That's concurrent validity. That do two measures or two tests that are intended to measure the same thing give similar results. That's concurrent validity. Similar idea here with convergent validity, except that there's some sort of a gold standard test result. So for example, for measuring body fat, the gold standard test is DEXA. So DEXA is dual X-ray absorptiometry, but nobody ever says it that way. It's always DEXA. And so that is an assessment of body fat using X-ray imaging. And so with that's the most accurate way to measure body fat. And so we would, in assessing the validity of a test and assessing whether it measures what it's supposed to measure, we would start with the one that we know is really good at measuring body fat, and then we would compare bioelectrical impedance to that, for example. That would be convergent validity if bioelectrical impedance is pretty close to DEXA. And typically it's pretty close. It's not quite as accurate. There's a lot more variability with like hydration status and those kinds of things, but it's pretty close. Predictive validity is what you would expect. It is the extent to which the test score corresponds with future performance or behavior. So it's really the overlap between testing and performance. So if they do really well on an agility test, when they go out there and play soccer, are they similarly agile, right? Can they fake defensive players out? Can they anticipate offensive players' moves and react to them? Those kinds of things. Discriminant validity is the ability of a test to distinguish between two different constructs. So basically it's the idea that it wouldn't, I don't know, you're not really going to use discriminant validity if I'm being honest. But so there's a low correlation, there's a low relationship between the results of tests designed to measure two different constructs. So for example, speed and flexibility, right? Those are very different things. And there may be some overlap between them, but just because you're flexible doesn't mean you're fast, and just because you're fast doesn't mean you're flexible. And so ideally, two different tests with discriminant validity would be able to distinguish between those two. They wouldn't necessarily, because you're fast, you'd also get a high score on the flexibility test, and vice versa. That's the idea there. All right, so key takeaway here, validity, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure, as opposed to reliability is, does the test offer consistent results? So repeatability of the measure, right? So as you can see there, an important qualifier here is that a test must be reliable to be valid. So in research books, oftentimes they'll use the example of a thermometer, that if you stick a thermometer in the oven and the thermometer says 300 degrees and it really is 300 degrees inside of the oven, well, that's a valid measure of the temperature inside of the oven. But if you put the thermometer in the oven and one time it says 300, the next time it says 350, the next time it says 250, the next time it says 200, it was valid once, but it's not very reliable. And so because it only offered a correct measure 1 out of every 4 times, then that is overall not a valid instrument, because while it was correct once, it was wrong 3 other times. And so it offers an unreliable measure. So that's the idea between the relationship between reliability and variability, between reliability and validity. So oftentimes reliability is related to measurement error, or lack of reliability, more accurately, is related to measurement error. So that can have a variety of different sources. The first one is intra-subject variability. So intra is inside of, so inside of the subject variability. So maybe one day they have a really good day, and then the next time they perform the test, they have a really bad day. And so that then can reduce the reliability of your measure and thus the overall validity. So if somebody comes in one day and they bench press 300 pounds, and then the next time they only get 250, and then the next time they only get 260, that's intra-subject variability. They were having a really good day that first day, and then after that, they just weren't able to hit that same level of performance. Lack of inter-rater reliability. So inter-rater, so that's between 2 individuals. What you've got there are maybe you have 2 different people assessing, let's stick with that. So maybe you're having your football team max out on squats, and in order to be a full lift, you're going to stipulate that the athlete's hip has to go below their knees. And so one of your assessors is really strict on that, and then the other guy next to him is not. And so the one who allows athletes to do higher squats, those athletes are going to get higher weights, because it's easier to lift more weight if you don't squat down quite as far, right? And so one particular group may have really high scores, the other group that has to squat lower is going to have lower scores, and so that then is a lack of inter-rater reliability. One guy is grading differently than the other. Lack of intra-rater variability, or lack of intra-rater reliability. What that is the same person's measuring differently on different occasions. So for example, if you're doing body fat testing and you're doing skin fold calipers, well, to do skin folds, you have to be comfortable grabbing somebody's fat on their thigh, on their pec, on their tricep, on their abdomen, and you got to be able to grab it and separate it from the underlying tissue. And so you got to pinch pretty hard, and that can be uncomfortable for the subject themselves. And so, maybe one time the guy had a bad day, your tester who's pinching an inch had a bad day, and so he's pinching really hard and getting really high body fat scores, and then the next time he's not pinching nearly as hard, and so his body fat scores are a little bit lower. It would actually probably go the other way, but it doesn't matter. So that person tested differently on 2 different days, in my example, depending upon their mood, right? And so then that is low intra-rater reliability. The same person was not reliable on multiple occasions. Like, there's some differences between how they perform the test on different days or at different times. And then the last one there is the failure of the test itself to provide consistent results. So maybe there's a problem with the test itself. Maybe trying to think of bad tests, but if they're bad tests, I'm probably not as aware of them. Yeah, that one's pretty self-explanatory. We'll go with that. So there's something wrong with the test itself. It's not conducted in a way, or not designed in a way that it's going to provide the same results over and over and over again. All right. So if you are, or when you are, selecting tests for a group of athletes as a strength and conditioning coach, things that you want to consider in designing your test battery, obviously metabolic specificity. So do we want to assess their aerobic performance, their anaerobic performance? As subsets of the anaerobic performance, do we want to assess their glycolytic ability, ATP phosphocreatine system? What is it that we need to assess, right? And so if we're looking at somebody like a cross-country athlete, we probably don't have to do strength testing necessarily. You can if you want, but more important is going to be testing their aerobic capacity. So we want to look at the demands of the sport and make sure that our tests are consistent with the metabolic demands of the sport, as well as the biomechanical patterns of the sport. So using my example from earlier, if we want to assess lower body strength, something like the 1 repetition max in either the back squat or the front squat, those are pretty good ways to assess that, as opposed to something like the leg press where they're lying down. Because if they can generate a lot of force in the leg press, well, that's great, but they don't perform their sport lying down. So we probably don't want to assess them in that way. Similarly, you could carry out that specificity even further. So if we're still looking at our cross-country athletes, let's go with that. Our cross-country athletes, they're not going to have periods of double leg stance, so where 2 feet are on the ground at one time. They're always going to be alternating. And so measuring their strength on both sides simultaneously actually isn't the most specific measure. And instead, what you might want to do is actually do one leg at a time. So maybe like lunge strength or something like that might be a more accurate way of assessing for their sport. All right. Other things you want to consider in designing your test battery are the experience and the training status of the athletes. First, with respect to their ability to perform the technique. So for example, maybe you've got a sport like basketball, like volleyball, where the ability to be explosive but also have good balance with something overhead, all of those things matter. And so maybe you decide, hey, I want to test them on overhead squats, right? Also known as snatch squats. Those are pretty hard to perform. You got to have a pretty good ankle flexibility, and especially if you're working with high school athletes and younger, they're not going to have the balance and they're not going to have the flexibility, or most of them won't. And so that's not a good test to include because they won't have the ability to master that technique. So you probably don't want to assess them on that. Think of something else. Similarly, their level of strength and endurance training. So when I was a high school coach, our athletic director decided that one of the things that he wanted to do on the first day of fall camp for football, and so this is in Texas in August, it was like 105 degrees, and we have 2 practices. We have one in the morning at like 8, and the other one I think is at like 3. So it's pretty hot for both of them, especially for the later one. And so one of the things that the coach wanted to do was to, after the very first practice, have them run some 300-yard shuttles and do that as like a pre-test of what their conditioning was coming into the season. But you probably don't want to fatigue them that much before they have to come back for an afternoon practice. They're going to sweat a bunch more. They're going to be at higher risk of developing heat illness for the afternoon practice. So we don't want that. And then the other thing is that they're extraordinarily deconditioned. So we probably don't want to stress them quite that much on day one. We want to have them have a little bit more of an acclimatization period, but also a period to get some base conditioning in before we assess their conditioning. So I wouldn't do that. You also see that, even collegiate professional strength and conditioning coaches get into trouble with this, like right after winter break, where they'll do some really hardcore testing sessions after the athletes haven't done anything for a month. And then that's where you can see athletes develop rhabdo and injuries. So age and sex, so both of those may affect the athlete's experience, interest, and ability. So in writing that up, I was thinking about, if you're doing 1 repetition max testing, so maybe you're doing like power cleans and bench press and squats, many of the usuals. If you're working with, middle-aged girls, they may not be real interested in doing 1 repetition max squat. And because they're not interested, they may not give very good effort, and so then you're not going to have a reliable test or really a valid test in that case either because of the lack of effort there. So just something to consider. So for those athletes, you may want to look at what are some other ways that I can assess their muscular strength without doing like 1 repetition max testing if that's not something they're going to give good effort at. Environmental factors, so that's basically a lot of the rest of this slideshow is talking about considerations for testing in the heat, or heat and humidity. So high temperature, high humidity can impair performance, pose health risks, and lower the validity of aerobic endurance tests. So, if you're going to have your athletes do the 300-yard shuttle, which is a miserable test to do if you've ever done it, if you're going to have your athletes do that, and they do it when it's 105 versus if they do it in like January or something when it is let's go with 40. Just based on the environment alone, having to deal with the heat versus working out in a fairly cool environment, they're going to perform much better when the environment is cooler. And so if you do that test, let's stick with that example. So we did the test in August when it was 105 out, the scores are terrible, and then we decided to do it again after winter break. We do it in January. Let's say we catch a really warm day in January, so it's in maybe the 40s when we do that test, and then they have really good results. So was it that the athletes have improved their performance or improved their, in that case, aerobic endurance that much between January and August? Probably not. A lot of that's going to owe to the environment itself. So it's just easier to work out, especially for endurance type training when it's cooler. So you'll see, some athletes will get as much, if we're doing like minutes per mile, some athletes will drop a full minute off of their mile pace over the course of several miles just from changing the temperature from in the 90s to in the 50s, for example. So it can make a huge difference in their performance. That's what I mentioned. Altitude, obviously. I don't know why you would, I don't think if you decided to fly to Colorado for a road trip, you'd also test them. But just so you know, testing at altitude is going to lower their performance, at least on endurance tests, not on strength or power. As we talked about in, I think it was in 202. If you're doing like sprint type events, jumping events, throwing events, those kinds of things at altitude, the performance actually tends to improve because there's less air resistance. But your aerobic performance is going to drop. So if you are testing in the heat, things to be aware of. So high heat and humidity can predispose them to heat exhaustion and potentially heat stroke. So you want to be on the lookout for signs that they may be having problems with those things. So one of the things about that is that it doesn't necessarily even need to be that hot. I guess I can click to the next slide. It doesn't necessarily even need to be that hot. I remember when I was in graduate school. So I went to graduate school in East Texas, and I was doing a rotation with the women's soccer team, and so they were doing a similar kind of thing. They had just come back for fall camp, and they were doing aerobic capacity testing pretty early on in their program, within the first couple days of returning to campus. Now, they were doing it first thing in the morning. It was like 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, so the sun hadn't really come up. It was super humid, but it wasn't especially hot because the sun wasn't up. It was probably, mid to high 80s, but it just felt like a warm, wet blanket because it was so humid out. But again, not especially hot. And so we had, I think, 3 athletes on the team who were from Canada. And so they had just come back or just come to Texas from Canada a couple days before, and they were not prepared for the heat. And so even though the rest of us didn't think it was especially hot, because most of our players were from Houston or Dallas, most of us didn't think it was that hot. The Canadian players couldn't complete the test because they just hadn't acclimated enough, right? So just something to be aware of is that even if you don't consider it to be especially hot or especially cold, some of your athletes may be from other places and they may not be particularly ready for that or for those environmental conditions. So you want to have them somewhat conditioned before you start the testing. Obviously avoid testing under the extremes. And if the temperature is too high outside, again, your test is not going to be valid anyway, so you might want to look into indoor facilities. Or do it early in the morning or late at night, preferably early in the morning. Other things, so you want to let them get acclimated for about a week before you test them. Make sure they're well hydrated before we start the testing protocol. Encourage them to drink, and then especially if you're in the sun, light colored, loose fitting stuff, preferably like polyester that's going to dry really quickly. In terms of heat, of symptoms to look for related to heat stroke, so the gist of it is heat exhaustion is it's not a precursor to heat stroke per se. Heat exhaustion is they just have to stop. Basically, they heart can't keep up with the demands of the exercise, and so they slow down, they have to stop. So that oftentimes is related to dehydration, because as you lose fluid volume, blood gets thicker, it gets more difficult for the heart to pump, and so then the heart can't deliver enough oxygen, they can't maintain their exercise intensity, they just stop. That's heat exhaustion. Heat stroke, on the other hand, is that they get their core temperature up close to 104 and then above 104. And with that really high core temperature, they start to have neurological symptoms. So you'll see they actually present as being very similar to looking like they're concussed in terms of the presentation. So things to look for, sorry, I got sidetracked there. So you're looking for neurological symptoms. So oftentimes it'll present similar to a concussion where they'll be confused. They just won't be with it. And it's in a lot of ways pretty easy to identify. I hate to say you know it when you see it, but in a similar fashion to with a concussion where they're just like, they're kind of glassy, they're just not there. You know, all the textbooks talk about with heat stroke, they've stopped sweating and their skin is flushed and all these things. Like those aren't, to me, those aren't super obvious indicators. I always found it just easier to just talk to the athlete. And if they just, you know, they can't string it together, they aren't as cognizant of what's going on around them, then you really start to think like, okay, I need to get this athlete in the shade. We need to get get some of their stuff off, their equipment off, and try to get them cooled off a little bit. So as you can see here, lack of sweat. And again, I don't think you're going to be able to identify that. So, but those, like, I think every textbook says that. So other things, still with endurance testing in the heat. So we talked about hyponatremia in 202. Hyponatremia is water intoxication. Basically, they drank so much water, they flushed out their sodium, and when they flushed out a bunch of sodium from their extracellular fluids, it forced a bunch of water into the intracellular space, causes cell swelling, even in the central, or especially in the central nervous system. So when you get swelling in the brain, then that also presents with those same kinds of symptoms where they're going to be confused, they're going to be nauseous, maybe dizzy, those kinds of things, and you can see those things there. Water intoxication is pretty unusual, especially in the athlete populations we would work with. You see water intoxication or hyponatremia most often in like recreational endurance athletes. So recreational marathoners, you see it in recreational triathletes where they've been told so often, stay hydrated, stay hydrated, stay hydrated. So they just drink tons and tons of water, plain water, rather than, you know, Gatorade or Pedialyte or whatever your favorite electrolyte beverage is. And so with that, again, they flush out too much sodium, and so then that can lead to those neurological symptoms. So I wouldn't, just be aware that it can present similarly, but the key question there would be to ask the athlete if they've been drinking a bunch of water, and if they haven't, which is pretty likely, then we would assume that their confusion and all of those things are related more to heat stroke and a high core temperature rather than a lack of sodium. In terms of training the testers, so we want to ensure good inter-rater reliability. And so with that, we want to make sure that everybody knows what they're looking for. So going back to my example from earlier, watching people squat, we want to make sure that if our standard is the hip has to be below the knee, we tell our testers that, and then we have them do some test runs. Say, okay, we're going to have this athlete squat. Was that deep enough? Yes or no? And then make sure they're both grading the same way. To that end, you may have a recording form that has basically check boxes. So, you know, did they take the weight out and control it before they started? Check. Did they go all the way down where their hip was below their knee on this back squat? Check. Did they come up and control the weight at the top? Check. And if they did all those three things, then it's a good lift. And so you may actually do that on a test form. In terms of test format, so consider, as you can see there, whether the athletes are going to be tested all at once, or if they're going to be in small groups. You know, the smaller the groups, the better. The more able your testers or your raters are going to be able to do in assessing whether or not they performed what they were supposed to. Now that said, I guess, so for something like the 300-yard shuttle, that may actually be something where it's helpful to do as a group, because it's pretty obvious when they finished. But also, if they're running next to other people, they tend to run faster. As opposed to if they're running by themselves, they don't often run as fast. It's harder to pace yourself if you're running alone. Other things. So it depends on what you're testing. So if you're doing things that are not close to the athlete's max, so warm-ups and stuff like that. 2 minutes of rest between. If we're maxing out, we want at least 3 minutes of rest, probably more like 5 to 8, so that the phosphagen system can recover. And at least 5 minutes between test batteries. So if we're going to do something like agility testing followed by strength testing, make sure you wait at least 5 minutes before your 5-10-5 and your max squat, or between the two. So in terms of sequencing of the test, there is a question about this in the quiz bank. So this is the order that you would go in. So we do non-fatiguing tests first. So things like the vertical jump, that's not especially a fatiguing test. You just go out there and jump as high as you can, like 3 times, and then that's it. Then we would do our agility tests. So again, things like the 5-10-5. And then we're going to do maximum power and strength. So squats, bench, etc. Then we'll do our 40-yard dash, sticking with my football examples here, followed by, if we're going to do muscular endurance, so things like max push-ups in 2 minutes, or how long can they hold a plank, then that's where we'll do that. Anaerobic capacity testing, so if you're going to do things like run the 400, run the 800, that's where that would go. And then aerobic capacity testing, so basically running to, not necessarily exhaustion, but testing their aerobic capacity there. So like I said, one of the field tests is the 12-minute run. So something like that, we would do that last. And then preparing them, so announce the date, time, et cetera. And that's in part for goal setting too. So if we say, okay, we want you to add 10 pounds to your bench press, well, the next testing session is going to be January 9th, or whatever that is. You want to have them practice the test beforehand to make sure that there isn't, you've gotten the learning effect out of the way, because oftentimes, if it's the first time you do something, you're not going to be very good at it. The second and third times, you're going to be better, but that's just the learning effect. That's not because you actually improved any sort of physiological parameter between the tests. You didn't improve your strength or power or whatever. You're just better at doing the test itself. So we want to make sure that they practice them before the test. Clear and simple instructions. Related to that, have a demonstration of what the test is supposed to look like, have a good warm-up, tell them their scores so they know where they are with respect to their goals, and then have a cool down, maybe some foam rolling, and then have kind of a debrief of here's how it went, here's where it was relative to your goals. And that is it. So the next time we move on to chapter 13, like I said, that chapter is actually how to do some of the tests. So there won't be a very long lecture on that, but there is a really long slideshow that has a bunch of different kinds of tests that you could use. And then there's a really long chapter in the book. So if you want to see more about each of those tests, you'd want to check out chapter 13 in the book. So we'll see you for that next week.